Welcome to episode 3 of the Emerging Leader podcast. This is a really, really important episode to me because it's all about coexisting with fear. What is fear? How do we overcome it? How do we even navigate it? And can we navigate it or overcome it at all? And I think this is such a critical topic to start with early on in the podcast because I've dealt with this for my entire life. And sorry, I don't have any solutions for you because I'm still dealing with it, even in this moment as I'm recording this episode. The Emerging Leader Podcast. So I wanted to start the episode with talking about why do we actually have fear? And this is something I've done a ton of reading on throughout the years, from the very beginning of my self-development journey with books like Awaken the Giant Within and all of the Tony Robbins stuff. I know he talks a lot about fear, but even more recently, just trying to understand why do we have it and where does it come from? Unfortunately, this is just a trait of humans, and it's not just humans, it's animals, it's everyone has this innate fear sense in us to protect us. You know, back when we were all kind of like cavemen, cave women, cave people, we needed this fear sense to keep us on our toes and to initiate that fight or flight response to actually save our lives. Whether we were running from tigers or, the snow monsters, I don't know. We needed this fear sense to actually protect us. Whereas now the fear that we experience is similar to that. It's that fight or flight response, but it's over much smaller things. We are no longer running from tigers or anything of that level of danger, I hope, where you're listening to this podcast. But we are dealing with everyday stress of meetings and presentations and public speaking and putting yourself out there online and all of these different things that by no means are fight or flight and our lives are at risk, but it has that same sense within our bodies. So our brain just doesn't know the difference between the two. And that's been really interesting throughout my journey with fear as well, is that I'm trying to kind of reprogram my brain and work on this to remind myself that I'm not running away from tigers. I'm just recording a podcast episode. But unfortunately, I might as well be running away from a tiger, or in fact, perhaps that would be less scary than doing this. But we must continue anyways. So one of the quotes about fear that I absolutely love from Leila Hormozi is that fear is a mile wide and an inch deep, or a kilometer wide and 2 centimeters deep, or whatever. The point being that it seems so much bigger than it actually is. And once you actually step into the puddle or the water here, you realize like, oh my God, I'm barely getting my socks wet. It's not that bad. And that has really helped me. It's like things often seem so much bigger in our minds than they actually are. But that's all well and good to say that, but then how do we actually deal with this throughout our lives? And I wanted to start off by talking a bit about my own fear and how I'm basically dealing with that. Fear has been something that I've had, as all of us have had, throughout my entire life. From university and the fear of like failing or embarrassing myself, all the way through to moving to Australia and, the fear of, oh my God, like, will I get a visa? How will I move out there? Will I get a job? And if you've listened to episode 2, you will have heard that moving to Australia was absolutely a roller coaster of emotions, a completely tumultuous time for me. And I have been filled with fear ever since then. I was filled with fear when I was almost deported twice, filled with fear when COVID happened and I was stuck in my house for months at a time, filled with fear as well to ask for different positions in my work or try new things or record this podcast. It constantly filled with fear. But then something else that I've read a lot on is courage. And courage is not about eliminating fear. I think let's just start this podcast off by saying that you're never actually going to be able to completely eliminate fear. It's never going to leave. You're never going to be at a state of complete peace where you're not worried about anything, unless you're meditating in the hills for 40 years. But even then, I'm sure that even the monks have some fear as well. So with that, that's where courage comes into it, because courage is feeling the fear and doing it anyways. Just like me recording this podcast, and in the very first episode, I talked about how this is an idea that I've had for over 2 years, but I have been completely paralyzed by fear of recording and putting myself out there and doing this podcast, which I still am. Honestly, like I fear the judgment, I fear what people are going to say, I fear all of it. And I fear this on a daily basis. So like, no matter what level you are at in your life, it's inevitable that you're still going to feel this fear. But having the courage to feel that fear and do it anyways is exactly where your power lies. So Carl Albrecht, who is a psychologist who wrote a book that I honestly haven't read, but have read some articles from his book, believes that you can classify fear into 5 main categories. And now look, his categories, the names are a bit, how's it going? But the idea, I believe. So at the bottom of the pyramid, there's the fear of extinction, fear of mutilation, fear of loss of autonomy, fear of separation, and at the top of the pyramid, the 5th fear is fear of ego death. Now, to break these down a bit more, fear of extinction is obviously, closer to death. Like we all fear death, or some of us have come to terms with it, but it's an underlying fear that a lot of people have. Secondly, fear of mutilation is a fear of obviously having not only like physically being mutilated, which is awful, but kind of that invasion of our boundaries, losing integrity of your body or anything like that. This also, I guess, plays into people's fear of like bugs and spiders and things like that. They're worried about things biting them, which I absolutely feel that with spiders. Loss of autonomy, so the fear of being immobilized, paralyzed, restricted, overwhelmed, entrapped, imprisoned, which we see a lot of this in people's relationships where they have this fear of this loss of autonomy, and they end up like subconsciously pushing people away so that they don't lose that. Fear of separation, so fear of abandonment, rejection, connectedness, community, which we also see in relationships where you're like kind of like grasping onto people. Perhaps there's an episode here down the track on attachment styles and what that comes to play in this. And then finally, which has the wildest title, but I think is probably the most relevant to people today, is the fear of ego death, or humiliation, shame, rejection from peers, judgment. And that ego death is absolutely what I'm afraid of personally. I feel that one more than anything else in this list. I fear judgment more than I fear death. Absolutely. And that's something else that I need to deal with. But I think it's interesting that this one, especially now in the days of social media and where everyone's lives are so public, that this fear of ego death or scrutiny and judgment is just so high in so many people. So how do we actually overcome that? And that's where I guess the title of this podcast comes, because like I said, you can't actually eliminate this fear. It's about how do we coexist with the fear and just live with it and have the courage to do the things anyways. Another concept that I really loved when I was starting my self-development journey and looking into fears and looking at these things was about creating examples in your life of where you actually have been successful in this. So if you have a lot of self-talk around, oh my God, I'm going to be judged, or I'm not good enough, or I'm never actually going to be able to do it successfully, or I won't be able to do it as well as that person, where are other examples in your life where you have been able to do that successfully? So for me, I have this narrative in my mind about not being able to finish things. So I have a lot of great ideas, but my consistency needs work. But I absolutely have examples in my life, especially when I moved to Australia and doing the hard things with the fear, that are examples of me doing that successfully. So often in my head, it will help me to reconcile my fear by using examples of previous situations where I've been completely fearful, but have just gained the courage and have done it anyways. Many of you wouldn't know that this is actually not the first podcast that I've launched. So during COVID, I did a complete experiment with myself where I was going to be completely scared and do it anyways. And that was launching my very first podcast, which I purposely, because of fear, did not really promote or do anything like that. And that wasn't the intention of it. It was more just about me getting beyond myself and just doing something to completion and putting it out there. So again, I have evidence that I've recorded a podcast before and can do it. And I didn't die, and I'm still here, and the judgment has not completely killed me yet. So it's time to keep going with the podcast. I think too, with fear, so often in our heads, we take this fear to the extreme. For example, with recording the podcast, oh my God, someone is going to judge me. And then if they judge me, I am going to, completely lose my way, or everyone in the street is going to laugh at me. And then I'm going to be stuck in my house because I can't leave. And then I won't be able to get food. And then I'm going to starve and I'm going to die. Which obviously that train of events is completely irrational, but this is often where our mind goes to as well. It often really pulls to the extreme about fear and about what we're worried about, and it lines it up often with death. And that extremism and the way that our brain is thinking is, again, it's just trying to protect us, but it doesn't help us in the moment. And also we need to be able to rationalize that with ourselves and say, like, that's actually not going to happen. If someone judges me on the internet, or they make a mean comment, or someone says, oh, the podcast isn't good, I'm not going to die. And ultimately also, there are always going to be people that say that. Another quote that I really, really like is that judgment and criticism is a prerequisite for success. If you're not getting criticized and you're not being judged, you likely aren't that successful. And I've experienced this throughout my professional life, being criticized by all sorts of different people. But that I just always use that as an example that I'm actually doing the right thing and I'm on the right track. Also, you will never be judged or criticized by people that are doing better than you. People that are doing better than you are worried about themselves. They're worried about their own thing and their own goals. And if anything, they're going to be super supportive and try and uplift you to a level that they're at. So if you're getting criticized, it's often by people that aren't doing as well as you. But also, I would just take that as a prerequisite for success. I think too, just on the note of success, that success is never born in your comfort zone. It's born on the fringes of life where you're a bit nervous. You're wondering geez, this is really pushing me into something that I'm not quite used to. But you need to continue to push that fringe in order to be successful. Everyone that's been successful in your life has done so uncomfortably and not by accident. Nothing in my life has happened by accident. Moving to Australia has not happened. Being in my current position has not happened. All of this stuff happens super intentionally and not without fear. You have to push the boundaries of the fringe and do it anyways. Especially when it comes to gaining new skills or asking for things that might be uncomfortable. That's where you need to continue to push the boundary. And I think actually too that fear is probably an indicator that that's the area that you need to push, and you need to continue to discover more about yourself and really push the boundary of what that is. If you're scared of having a conversation with someone or asking for something, what you want is probably on the other side of that. One of my favorite all-time quotes that I think about this all the time, and it has completely transformed the way that I manage my team or work in my job, is that everything you want is on the other side of a hard conversation. Whether that's with a staff member that isn't performing, whether that's with your boss saying hey, I actually, I like my job, but I would actually rather move in this direction, or with your partner and saying hey, actually, what I need out of this relationship is something a bit different. How can we make that work? Everything that you want is on the other side of these hard conversations. And none of this is going to happen without fear. In fact, I still, even though I've had these conversations hundreds of times and it's a practice and something that I've worked up to and have continued to work up the courage to have more of these conversations on, it's absolutely something that will never be completely seamless. It will never be fearless. It will always require courage to have these conversations. So if you take anything away from this episode, it's that everything you want happens on the other side of hard conversations or fear in the fringes of that area of like, how can I continue to push myself and train myself in these areas in order to be more successful? I think, getting past your fear and like courage is a skill, and it's something that needs to be trained. And over time is something that you'll absolutely get better with if you just give yourself the chance and keep pushing forward with these hard conversations and fearful things. What could you do if you were to have one hard conversation per week? Joe and I have this thing, we call it Scary Tuesdays at our house, where after work, we'll work on projects that we're kind of putting off, or things that we're putting off because we're quite scared. Scared about judgment or scared about whatever. So for him, he's working on a project with some people that he respects so much that he's scared of like shipping it and sending it out to them because he wants it to be perfect. And so he works on that on Scary Tuesdays. I'll work on the podcast. I'll work on all sorts of different things. And again, you don't need a Scary Tuesday or a Spooky Wednesday or whatever, but what would your life look like if you were focused on having at least one of these hard conversations every single week? And ever since I've started doing that, and also just accepting that these conversations aren't personal, and just to have the conversation, even though I'm scared, my life has completely changed. I think another thing that's really valuable to do is to actually shine a light on the fear. It's the old kind of like monster under the bed analogy where, you look under your bed and it looks like there's a spooky monster, but as soon as you shine a light on it, it's actually just a pile of your laundry that you've left under there, like me. So how about you get real with yourself about what's actually causing the fear here? Is it judgment? Is it that you're worried about not being good enough? For me, it was, I was worried about this because I'm like, oh, what if people from university see it? Okay, well, what happens if they do see it? Oh, well, they're going to judge me. How will I actually know that they've judged me? Oh, well, what if they make rude comments? Which I don't think they would. How will I even know about the comments? Okay, if they post it publicly, but like, what's the likelihood of them actually posting that publicly? Not super likely. And what if they do post these comments? Then I can just delete them or ignore them. And what will it actually mean about me? Or what is this bringing up in me that I'm so worried about? And I think that this shining a light on this is really a good method for unpacking anything, whether you're angry or fearful or otherwise. I think it's a really great method and something that I use all the time to truly uncover what I'm actually worried about. What am I really fearful about? And also getting real with the likelihood of those outcomes. The final topic I wanted to touch on in this episode about coexisting with fear is something called the spotlight effect. Now, the spotlight effect is something that psychologists use to refer to the tendency to overestimate how much other people notice about us. So it's when you're at an event or you're at, doing whatever, you're in a room somewhere and you feel like everyone is looking at you. It's this tendency that we feel like all of the eyes are on us, or the spotlight is on us, or the pressure is on us, but actually it's not nearly to the extent that we believe it is. And this was super hilarious when a very, very close family friend of ours, who was just amazing, she once said to me when I was younger, because again, I was just so worried about this judgment, I was just like freaking out about it, and she says like, what makes you think that you're so important that these people are thinking about you? Like, people are just thinking about themselves. They're likely also having the spotlight effect and thinking that everyone else is looking at them. Everyone is so obsessed with themselves and in their own head that I guarantee they're really not as focused on you as you think they are. So that was a really interesting thing for me. And I think the spotlight effect perfectly summarizes that feeling of like, oh my God, everyone is looking at me, when in reality, people are very concerned about themselves and are likely not paying as much attention to you as you think they are. So that was another good one that I really, really enjoyed. So with that, I would like to wrap up this episode with an apology for not solving your fear problem. Honestly, I'm not going to be able to solve this for you because everyone just has to coexist with fear. We need to instead of trying to focus on eliminating fear from our lives, we need to focus on how do we build more courage? How do we practice more courage in our lives to do the hard things, knowing that success happens on the fringes. Success happens in that gray area between like being comfortable and not out of the comfort zone. That's where it happens. And also that people are not nearly as, they're not judging you nearly as much as you think they are. And I hope that that has comfort. Honestly, I don't even know if it comforts me, but I think it's about how do we be scared and do it anyways. So if I was to task you with one thing out of this episode, it would be to do one thing that scares you every week. What is a hard conversation that you can have every week? You know, this week it might be asking for a raise. It might be sitting down with your partner and saying, hey, I'm not actually getting what I need out of this relationship. Can we do something else? It might be something not nearly as scary as that, because those are definitely scary, but work up to it. Practice it as a skill. What's one hard thing or one hard conversation that you can have every week? And then from there, you'll be able to build up this incredible evidence bank, not that I don't think you already have one, of all of these areas in your life where you've been scared and you've just done it anyways. And focus on that. And I think you will be so surprised at the success that comes to you from that. So I think it was really important to cover this in one of the first episodes on the podcast, because obviously it's something that I still deal with on a daily basis, nonstop, worried about the judgment of others. And here I am, scared, recording this podcast, but I'm just going to post it anyways. Something that helps with that is scheduling posts so that I can just schedule it and not have to think about it, and then not check social media for a week. I remember the first time I posted something on LinkedIn, I literally did not go on LinkedIn for 3 weeks because I was so worried that the comments would be absolute scrutiny, you know, like, Ash, you're a complete idiot. You don't know anything about this topic. And I was surprised because I went on LinkedIn 3 weeks later, you know, kind of like with my eyes closed, and it was just nonstop like positivity in the comments, which I was very lucky in that sense, but it's interesting. And, you know, people often assume that I'm not scared of doing stuff, but that's absolutely not the case. I'm scared, but doing it anyways. Keep in mind Layla's quote about fear being a mile wide, but only an inch deep. Once you step in it, it's not that bad, and just keep pushing yourselves, and your threshold will be completely changed, and your success will be completely changed as well. Thank you so much for joining me on this episode. I hope you've enjoyed it. I would really welcome any of your comments, even though I might not check them for ages because I'm scared of posting the episode. Kidding. But please reach out if you have any comments, questions, or suggestions on future episodes. I would absolutely love to hear from you. And also, please make sure that you subscribe or follow the podcast on whatever you're listening to help us reach more people everywhere and more young professionals. So I really appreciate your support. I hope you have an amazing day wherever you're listening from, and I'll catch you on the next episode. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I'm recording today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders that are listening to the podcast.